I never thought my life would spiral into chaos like this. At least, not after all the years I've spent trying to keep things simple and predictable. My name is Margaret Whitmore, Maggie to those who know me well, and I've lived in this quaint little town of Maplewood, New York for as long as I can remember. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, but they also show up with casseroles when you're grieving. I raised Ethan here alone after my husband passed away when Ethan was just 10. Those were hard years, but we got through them together, or so I thought. My house, a Victorian relic that creaks in the wind, has been in my family since my grandmother's time. It's filled with memories. Ethan's first steps on the staircase, his laughter echoing through the halls as he played hide and seek, and later, the silence that settled in once he left for college. Now it feels too big for one person, though I've grown used to the quiet. Or at least I had until everything changed. When Ethan called to tell me he was bringing someone home, a woman named Sophia Loren, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. A French fashion designer? That sounded so far removed from the life I'd built for us here in Maplewood. Still, I wanted to be supportive. After all, Ethan was my pride and joy, even if he'd become more of a stranger than a son over the years. The moment Sophia walked through my door, I could feel something off about her. She was beautiful, yes, with her perfectly coiffed hair and tailored outfits, but there was an edge to her smile, a sharpness that made me uneasy. She complimented my home, calling it charmingly rustic, which somehow didn't feel like a compliment at all. And then there was the way she looked at Ethan. Not with love exactly, but with something closer to possession. But who was I to judge? Maybe I was just being paranoid. It wasn't long before the cracks started to show. During dinner, Sophia casually mentioned how Ethan had always been so driven, and implied that perhaps I hadn't pushed him enough growing up. Her words stung, but I tried to brush them off. When Ethan chimed in, agreeing with her, I realized this wasn't just idle chatter. It was a calculated attack. By the end of the night, I felt like I'd been put on trial and Sophia was the prosecutor. But the real blow came weeks later when I found myself scrolling through Ethan's credit card statements, a habit I picked up during his college years to ensure he wasn't overspending. There were charges I didn't recognize. Luxury hotels, designer clothes, extravagant meals, all under Sophia's name. I confronted Ethan about it, expecting him to see reason. Instead, he snapped, accusing me of spying and meddling. "You've always done this, Mom," he shouted. "You can't let go." His words cut deeper than I cared to admit. After that fight, Ethan stopped calling. Texts went unanswered, visits ceased altogether. For the first time in my life, I truly felt abandoned by my own child. The house, already too big for one person, now felt suffocating. Every corner reminded me of Ethan, the sound of his laugh, the way he used to sneak cookies from the jar. Now all I had were questions. Had I done something wrong? Was I really the overbearing mother Sophia painted me to be? I couldn't sit idly by while Sophia turned my son against me. So I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to an old friend, Harold Brooks, a retired detective who still owed me a favor from our high school days. Over coffee, I told him everything. The strange behavior, the financial discrepancies, the gut feeling that something wasn't right. Harry listened intently, nodding occasionally. "Let's see what we can find," he said finally. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Harry proved to be invaluable. Within days, he uncovered information that sent chills down my spine. Sophia Loren wasn't just a glamorous fashion designer. She was a con artist with a history of fraud. Years ago in Paris, she'd swindled investors out of millions and fled the country before authorities could catch her. The case had gone cold, but Harry managed to track down emails and documents linking her to the scheme. When I saw the evidence, my heart sank. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. Sophia had wrapped Ethan around her finger, and now she was pulling strings to keep him isolated from anyone who might question her motives. I knew I had to act, but how could I get through to Ethan when he refused to listen? Desperation drove me to drastic measures. I booked a flight to Tuscany, where Ethan and Sophia were hosting their wedding weekend at a luxurious villa. I told myself I wouldn't cause a scene. I just needed to talk to Ethan to make him see the truth. But when I arrived, the tension was palpable. Sophia glared at me like I was an uninvited pest, while Ethan avoided eye contact entirely. At the rehearsal dinner, Sophia delivered the final blow. In front of everyone, she accused me of ruining Ethan's life, of clinging to him out of jealousy. "She doesn't want you to be happy, Ethan," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with venom. She never has. I stood there, frozen, as Ethan nodded in agreement. That's when I realized I had nothing left to lose. With trembling hands, I pulled out the folder containing all the evidence Harry and I had gathered. I laid it bare for everyone to see. Bank records, emails, police reports. "This is who your fiancé really is," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Gasps rippled through the room, but Ethan's reaction was what broke my heart. He didn't believe me. He called me delusional, accused me of fabricating lies to sabotage his happiness. Tears streaming down my face, I left the villa, leaving behind a USB drive with copies of the evidence. As I walked away, I wondered if I'd lost my son forever. But deep down, I knew I'd done the right thing, even if it cost me everything. That night, I sat alone in my rented room at a small inn near the villa, staring out the window at the Tuscan hills bathed in moonlight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets outside. My chest felt hollow, like someone had reached in and scooped out all the joy I'd ever known. Ethan's face, his anger, his disbelief, kept flashing in my mind. How could he not see the truth? Was Sophia's spell really that powerful? I replayed the evening over and over again, wondering if I could have handled it differently. Should I have been more subtle? Less confrontational? But no matter how many angles I examined, the outcome always came back to the same painful reality. My son had chosen her over me. It wasn't just losing Ethan that hurt. It was knowing that he thought I was the villain in his story. As I lay down on the stiff mattress, clutching the edge of the blanket like it might anchor me to something solid, I made myself a promise. If this was the end, if Ethan never forgave me, I would still fight for him. Not because I wanted redemption, but because he deserved to know the truth even if he couldn't accept it now. The next morning, I woke up to find an unread text from Harry waiting for me. "Did you leave the USB drive?" It read. My stomach dropped. Apparently, Ethan had found it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared at the screen, imagining what must be going through his head. Would he watch the footage? Would he dismiss it outright as another one of my supposed lies? Or, and this was the sliver of hope I clung to, would he finally see Sophia for who she truly was? By midday, I hadn't heard anything from Ethan or anyone else. The wedding was scheduled for later that afternoon, and part of me wondered if it would even happen. What if Ethan confronted Sophia? What if she talked her way out of it, twisting the narrative yet again? I felt powerless, stuck in limbo between hope and despair. All I could do was wait. When I arrived back at the villa later that day, the atmosphere was tense. Guests milled about nervously, whispering behind their hands. Something had clearly happened, though no one seemed willing to say what. Then I saw Ethan pacing near the garden gazebo, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was a mix of fury and devastation, a look I'd never seen on him before. Sophia was nowhere to be found. It turned out that Ethan had watched the contents of the USB drive late into the night. At first, he tried to rationalize it away, convincing himself it was some elaborate fabrication. But then he stumbled upon audio recordings, private conversations where Sophia mocked him, calling him gullible, and bragging about how easy it had been to manipulate him. That's when the walls came crashing down. He called off the wedding immediately and demanded answers from Sophia. She denied everything, of course, but the evidence was undeniable. By morning, she'd fled the villa, leaving behind only a hastily packed suitcase and a note claiming she'd never loved him anyway. Ethan didn't speak to me for days after that. He returned to New York without a word, retreating into his work like he always did when things got tough. Meanwhile, news of Sophia's disappearance spread quickly. Thanks to the documents I'd provided, Interpol reopened her old fraud case, issuing a warrant for her arrest. Reporters descended on Maplewood, eager to interview the woman who'd exposed an international scammer. But I refused to talk to them. This wasn't about fame or vindication. It was about my son. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of radio silence, Ethan showed up at my doorstep. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes betraying the weight he carried. For a moment we just stood there staring at each other. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Those 3 words unleashed a floodgate of emotions. I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face. We spent hours talking, unraveling the tangled web of misunderstandings and pain that had driven us apart. He admitted he'd let ambition and pride blind him to Sophia's manipulations, and to the love I'd always tried to give him. In the months that followed, Ethan and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, trust takes time to mend, but we were determined to make it work. He started coming home more often, helping me tend to the garden or cooking meals in the kitchen. Slowly, the house began to feel less empty. Meanwhile, Sophia's name faded from headlines as she evaded capture, rumored to be hiding somewhere in Southeast Asia. Though I hated what she'd done to my family, I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for her. She was running from herself as much as from the law. Life wasn't perfect, but it was better. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness was within reach again. As the seasons changed, so did our lives. Ethan began to rediscover parts of himself that he'd buried under years of relentless ambition. On weekends, he'd come home and help me with chores around the house, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. We'd spend hours gardening together, pulling weeds and planting new flowers in the backyard. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch swing, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when Ethan would snap at me over something trivial or retreat into silence after a long day at work. But now, instead of letting those moments fester, we talked them through. Slowly but surely, we were learning how to be mother and son again, not just people sharing space. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace flipping through old photo albums, Ethan paused on a picture of him at 10 years old, grinning ear to ear while holding up a trophy from his little league team. "Do you remember this?" he asked, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I nodded, smiling softly. "You were so proud that day," I replied. For the first time in years, it felt like we were piecing ourselves back together. While Ethan and I worked on healing our bond, Detective Harry Brooks became a regular fixture in my life. He'd stop by unannounced with groceries or offer to fix things around the house that had been broken for years. At first, I thought it was just his way of checking in on me, but soon I realized there was more to it. One chilly November afternoon, Harry showed up with a thermos of hot cocoa and a sheepish grin. "Mind if I join you for a walk?" he asked. As we strolled through the crisp autumn leaves, he started opening up about his own past, how he'd lost his wife to cancer years ago and how lonely he'd felt ever since. By the time we returned to the house, my cheeks were flushed not just from the cold but from the warmth of his words. Later that night, as I settled into bed, I couldn't help but smile. Harry wasn't just an old friend anymore. He was becoming something more. And for the first time in decades, I found myself looking forward to what might come next. By December, Ethan announced he wanted to host Christmas dinner at my house, a tradition we hadn't observed in years. He invited close friends, colleagues, and even some of his old high school buddies who still lived nearby. The idea thrilled me, though I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was trying to make up for lost time. Still, I threw myself into preparations, baking pies, decorating the tree, and dusting off the good china. On Christmas Eve, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter. It was strange yet comforting to see Ethan mingling so easily with people he'd once pushed away. As dessert was served, Harry stood up unexpectedly, tapping his glass to get everyone's attention. My heart skipped a beat when he turned to me and said, "Maggie, you've been the light in my life these past few months. Would you do me the honor of being my wife?" The room erupted in cheers, and tears blurred my vision as I nodded yes. Ethan hugged me tightly afterward, whispering, "I'm happy for you, Mom." In that moment, surrounded by love and forgiveness, I felt whole again. New Year's Eve brought quiet reflection. Sitting alone in my study, I opened my journal and began writing. So much had changed in the past year, some of it painful, some of it beautiful, but every experience had taught me something valuable. I wrote about Sophia's betrayal, Ethan's anger, and the long road to reconciliation. I wrote about Harry's kindness and the unexpected second chance at love. Most importantly, I wrote about hope, the kind that keeps you going even when everything seems lost. Closing the journal, I glanced out the window at the snow-covered yard. Life is unpredictable, I realized. People will disappoint you and sometimes they'll surprise you. But if you hold on to love and trust your instincts, you can weather any storm. In the spring, Ethan surprised me by moving back to Maplewood. He decided to open a small legal practice in town, focusing on helping local families navigate custody battles and estate planning. "It's time I gave back to the community that raised me," he said one evening over dinner. Seeing him reconnect with the town, and with himself, filled me with pride. Harry and I set a date for our wedding in June, opting for a simple ceremony in the garden behind my house. Ethan walked me down the aisle, his arm steady beneath mine. As I exchanged vows with Harry, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd all come, from broken relationships to newfound beginnings. Sophia's case remained unresolved, though occasional updates trickled in from Interpol. Apparently, she'd surfaced briefly in Bali before disappearing again. While part of me hoped justice would find her eventually, I refused to let her linger in my thoughts. She no longer had power over us. Instead, I focused on cherishing the present. Every morning, I woke up grateful for the family I'd rebuilt and the love I'd found. Ethan and I weren't perfect. We argued occasionally, just like any mother and son, but we communicated openly and forgave quickly. That, I realized, was the key to lasting bonds. One sunny afternoon, Ethan brought home a surprise. A puppy. "He needs a home," Ethan explained, setting the wriggling golden retriever pup in my lap. "And I figured we could use some extra joy around here." We named him Charlie, and he quickly became the heart of our household, bounding through the halls and demanding belly rubs. Watching Ethan dote on Charlie reminded me of the days when he was a child, full of curiosity and wonder. It struck me then that while life moves forward, certain cycles repeat themselves. Only this time I got to witness it as a grandmother figure rather than a mother. On a rainy afternoon, I sat down to write a letter. To my younger self, to Ethan, and to anyone else who might need to hear it. "Trust your instincts," I wrote. "Love fiercely, forgive freely, and never underestimate the strength of family ties. Even when it feels like the world is falling apart, hold on. Because somewhere beyond the pain lies redemption." Sealing the letter in an envelope, I tucked it away in my desk drawer. Someday perhaps I'd share it. For now, it was enough to know that I'd faced my struggles head-on and emerged stronger for it. As summer approached, our lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan's practice flourished, and Harry and I grew closer with each passing day. Our blended family, complete with Charlie's antics, felt like a miracle I didn't deserve but was deeply grateful for nonetheless. One evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, Ethan raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, smiling at me. We clinked glasses, laughter filling the air. For the first time in years, I believed in the promise of tomorrow. As the years rolled on, I found myself reflecting more and more on the lessons life had taught me. One crisp autumn morning, while sitting in my favorite armchair with a steaming cup of tea, I realized something profound. Forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger. It's about reclaiming your peace. Ethan and I had both carried so much resentment. Him toward me for what he perceived as overprotection, and me toward him for shutting me out. But through honesty and vulnerability, we'd managed to heal those wounds. That same day, I decided to start a small project. A scrapbook filled with memories of Ethan's childhood, letters we'd exchanged during tough times, and photos from recent gatherings. It wasn't just for nostalgia. It was a reminder that families are built not on perfection but on perseverance. On the cover, I wrote in bold letters, "Our story, love, loss, and redemption." When I showed it to Ethan later that week, his eyes welled up. "Thanks, Mom," he said simply, hugging me tightly. "Some things don't need words." Harry too brought unexpected joy into my life. He wasn't the kind of man who showered you with grand gestures or flowery speeches. He was steady, dependable, and endlessly kind. Every Saturday he'd take Charlie for long walks around the neighborhood, returning with stories of people they'd met along the way. Sometimes he'd bring home fresh flowers or bake cookies that smelled like cinnamon and comfort. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Harry turned to me and said, "You know, Maggie, I never thought I'd find love again after losing Helen. But here we are. And honestly, I think she'd approve." His words caught me off guard and tears pricked my eyes. In that moment, I understood how rare it is to find someone who truly sees you, flaws and all, and chooses to stay anyway. Years passed, and our little family continued to grow in ways I never imagined. Ethan met someone, a sweet, down-to-earth woman named Claire, and within a year they were married. Their wedding was simple yet beautiful, held right here in Maplewood under a canopy of twinkling lights. As I watched them exchange vows, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come from that disastrous weekend in Tuscany. The following spring, Claire gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, and suddenly I became a grandmother. Holding those tiny bundles in my arms, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life had thrown its share of challenges at us, but here we were, thriving against all odds. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, as I rocked my granddaughter to sleep, I thought back to the journal entry I'd written years ago. About hope, resilience, and the power of love. I realized then that every struggle we'd faced had led us to this moment. A life filled with laughter, connection, and purpose. Looking back, I see now that life is a series of chapters, each one shaping the next. There were days when I doubted whether Ethan and I would ever reconcile, whether I'd ever feel whole again after Sophia's betrayal. But through it all, I learned that even the darkest storms eventually give way to sunlight. If there's one thing I want to leave behind for my grandchildren, and for anyone reading this, it's this. Trust yourself, cherish your loved ones, and never stop believing in second chances. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the sweetest victories. And so, with a heart full of love and a house alive with laughter, I close this chapter of my story. But I know the best is yet to come.